When the final gift released, the ever-present accusations that Hoyo retconned the Harbingers were resurrected once again. One of the hardest parts of writing a long-running story is that audiences remember everything. For anything with any popularity, there will be fans who pay close attention to even the smallest throwaway line of dialogue or the most obscure detail hidden in the corner of a long-forgotten trailer. It's inevitable that the writers will eventually mess things up, release something which contradicts something which came before. Often, it's only a minor inconsistency, but sometimes it can become a problem. But the strange thing is, the only so-called retcon in the trailer which bothered me is one that almost nobody is talking about. I think this whole discussion comes from people talking past each other, with some using the word retcon to express things which don't match its definition, and others perhaps ignoring any valid points that first group were trying to make. Retcon is an abbreviation of retroactive continuity. It means someone has told a story and then in a later installment, they changed something about the events which happened in the earlier section. A retcon contradicts the established facts, or at the very least attaches new significance or new explanation to past events which was not there in the original intent. Of course, sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between established facts and a subjective idea that you're personally invested in. To explore a concrete example, there is a very clear retcon in Sandroni's trailer, one which bothered me a lot. It's just not one which I've seen many people complain about. The Soul of Not Cry story centers on Columbina's emotional journey to the point where people's perspective on the success or failure of the region as a whole largely depends on their feelings towards her. She begins the story feeling lost and disconnected. From her perspective, all relationships are transactional, devoid of any personal connection. The Scions worshipped her and they expected her to bestow gifts in return. The Fatui ensured her material needs were met in exchange for access to her power and reputation. When we met her, she expected us to behave in the same way. Over the course of the story, her worldview is challenged. She observes others behaving in ways which don't match her expectations, and then she learns that there are people who care for her own sake. The people who see her as a friend actively choose to make sacrifices for her, with no expectation of receiving anything in return. By the end, she has a new perspective, and she develops a deep connection to not only Not Cry as a whole, but to the specific people she now counts as friends. As I've emphasized before, this is not an original or groundbreaking story, but I'd argue that Hoyo got the basics right and avoided many of their usual mistakes. As a result, this simple story felt genuinely moving. One narrative beat, which was essential to Columbina's emotional journey, was her perspective on her past relationships, particularly with Sandroni. The few glimpses we saw of Columbina's past showed her in a very aloof, awkward, oddball way, trying to connect to Sandroni. Sandroni responded with anger and frustration. It was easy to see how Columbina could interpret Sandroni's interactions as genuine dislike, even while her deep need for companionship compelled her to continue trying despite Sandroni's complaints. These moments came across as a deft way to characterize both of them, and their interactions were genuinely entertaining, the kind of storytelling I'd been begging for. Her understanding of these past events was first challenged when she watched a couple of Frostmoon Scions play fighting together. She expected the higher-ranked Scion to punish the other, but instead they were both having fun. Then, during the festival, Columbina watches on as Lauma and Nefer playfully trade barbs with one another, and she finally understands that their bickering is actually a sign of a strong relationship. Thanks to this new insight, Columbina is able to see her own memories in a new light. Perhaps Sandroni's reactions didn't come from a feeling of disgust, and maybe there was some affection lurking there as well. This aspect of her character arc is paid off during two of the festival scenes. In one, she starts a water balloon fight with Nefer, Arlecchino, and Yehoda. In the other, she challenges Sandroni to a friendly competition and bonks her on the head as her reward when she wins. Both scenes express that same playful aggression, since for the first time, Columbina understands the affection which underpins it all. But then, we come to Sandroni's animated short. Columbina's first actions in the short are a perfect fit for her existing narrative. She behaves exactly as you'd expect, almost like an annoying little sister, singing next to Sandroni's door to wake her up in time to go to a Harbinger's meeting. Sandroni's irritated response and dismissal of Columbina's overtures match everything we've known so far. But later on, Columbina starts a pillow fight. It's a cute moment, but it's exactly the playful aggression which had been such a crucial foundation for her character arc. We were explicitly shown that she did not understand this behavior can be an expression of affection, so this moment does not match the established continuity at all. Consider an alternative. Instead of starting a pillow fight, Columbina could have just wandered around in the background poking at Sandroni's belongings, rearranging them a little, with Sandroni occasionally yelling at her to stop touching my stuff. That would have left the original narrative intact while still providing a similar emotional moment. They could have even hinted that Sandroni missed Columbina once she was gone by having her poke at her own belongings, repeating the annoying actions she wished Columbina was still around to do. This might seem like a really minor complaint, but I'd argue it's a pretty significant contradiction to a fundamental part of her character arc. Thankfully, it's just a brief moment in the trailer. While it's technically canon, I generally feel that each type of content holds different weight. The main story is the most important, other in-game stories have little less emphasis, and even the in-world ephemera holds more weight than external content. But while there are some smaller moments like this which do break the continuity in some subtle way, if we look at the story as a whole, I don't think there's an argument that Hoyo's treatment of the Harbingers in general, or of Sandroni, Columbina, and Arlecchino in particular, is a retcon. It cannot be a retcon because there was no continuity to contradict or change in the first place. Hints and innuendo do not constitute a story. However, if retcon is the wrong word for what people are feeling, then what actually is the problem? At its core, this is about the gap between the promises the writers made and the expectations the audience built upon them. The idea of promises and payoffs is fundamental to all fiction. When a writer introduces something like a character or a conflict or even just a concept, they're making an implicit promise that the story which follows will explore it in an interesting way and that in the end there will be a satisfying payoff to the time the audience invested in the story. Of course, that journey isn't always linear, and sometimes the entire purpose of a story is to subvert the expectations which stem from how central this idea is to most storytelling, but this is important, especially in a more commercialized one like Genshin. This is part of why I find it fascinating to examine the opening of any given story in isolation before you've experienced the rest. Each person will have a different interpretation of what promises were made and which are important, and each unique perspective gives everything that follows a slightly different flavor. And for games like Genshin, before the audience experience any chapter of the story, marketing can play a crucial role in setting expectations, especially for those who are the most engaged. But marketing can be misleading. Its goal is to grab your attention, either to entice you into trying the product in the first place, or to build excitement if you're already engaged. And while it really should reflect the source material, that is not its purpose, and a little lack of accuracy along the way is almost expected. They even had to delete and re-upload the final gift because the original version had Alan call her Sandroni, even though that's her Harbinger name. One example, which I thought was particularly ridiculous, was the marketing for Genshin's version 5.4. That patch saw us return to Inazuma for the Mikavo Festival, along with the release of Yume Mizuki Mizuki and the Aiza Bathhouse. The marketing for that patch put just a little more emphasis on that last point than it really deserved. The onsen scenes were front and center in a way which made them seem more lewd than they actually were, clearly to entice thirsty people and drive up interest. In reality, they were brief relaxation scenes at the end of a quest which came across as perfectly innocent and barely lasted any time at all. For me, the marketing there kind of misrepresented the product. It set expectations which Hoyo would obviously know were never going to be fulfilled by the game. The point, instead, was to get people talking, and I guess it succeeded there. And before we look closer at the Fatui and the Harbingers, one last detail worth highlighting is the difference between a villain and an antagonist. An antagonist is a character in a story who opposes the protagonist, while a villain is a character who is actively evil or malicious. There is a crossover between the two, because an antagonistic villain is a potent combination, especially when you have a morally upstanding protagonist. But you can have a non-villainous antagonist, such as a policeman hunting down a protagonist who lives outside the law, and you can even have an actively villainous protagonist too. One deeper purpose of most antagonists, which is mostly missing in Genshin, is the idea that they're supposed to challenge the ideals of the protagonist. Their actions are often the backdrop and the contrast, which reveal who the protagonist truly is and what they believe in. In Genshin, the traveler doesn't have ideals or even much of a personality, so this rich aspect of antagonists is missing. But I think Genshin fills that void in a different way, which we'll get back to later on. When it comes to the Fatui, and the Harbingers in particular, I feel like there's two distinct phases in their development, with a clear split point at the release of the Winter Nights Lazzo trailer. In the early game, they were a prominent antagonistic faction. Fatui soldiers are scattered across the map for us to fight, and countless questlines threw us into direct conflict with their goals. They seem to be a dark force which aimed to disrupt the idyllic, peaceful world we found ourselves exploring, and the first three Harbingers we met only seemed to reinforce that perspective. Signora came across as a textbook shallow villain in her Archon Conquest appearances, a mean, malicious witch who took joy in abusing her position of power over others. She seemed arrogant to a fault, and her portrayal left little room for nuance. She seemed the clearest confirmation that our initial perspective on the Fatui might be accurate. Childe, meanwhile, was cheerful and open, but beneath his friendly demeanor, he turned out to be fundamentally amoral, happy to casually commit genocide, only interested in searching for challenging opponents he could pit himself against. And third, Scaramouche, an irritating, arrogant little prig who seemed to take vicious delight in asserting his fundamental superiority over everyone around him. However, even back then, there were signs of greater depth. Quests involving the foot soldiers sometimes leaned on tropes of reluctant soldiers following orders, for example, and there was always a contrast between the Fatui's admittedly shady goals and the even more negative portrayal of the Abyss Order as our other main antagonists. Both Zhongli and Yaemiko happily handed over the Gnosis of their respective nations to the Fatui without a fight, a clear hint that perhaps their goals were not an outright negative. Childe's character story also showed there was much more to him than we saw in the Archon quests. His brother brought out an entirely different side to him as he sheltered Tusa from the truth of the world in order to protect his innocent joy. Even though I couldn't bring myself to forgive Childe for his betrayal, it seemed pretty clear to me that even the Harbingers were intended to have nuance and depth. And that's without even looking into the game's ephemera. For example, the backstory of the Crimson Witch of Flames explains Signora's malevolence, so even her fiery aggression is tempered by understanding. The Winter Knights Lazo dropped completely out of nowhere, a seismic event which drove the community into a frenzy of speculation. Before then, we didn't even know the names of most of the Harbingers, yet in one fell swoop we got to see them all. Columbina's singing was ethereal, a lament floating in the background which made the whole experience feel almost surreal. While they're all clearly working together towards the same goals, the atmosphere of the group felt frosty. Much of the conversation felt official and reserved and formal, yet filled with tension and sniping, and many seemed to be on guard. Before the Winter Knights Lazo, I was lukewarm on the Harbingers we'd met so far. I hoped they'd gain more depth over time, but up until that point they were pretty tame, more like caricatures of B-movie villains than intimidating enemies I was excited to confront. While I enjoy simple stories with iconic villains, for me they work best with a more constrained scope. As soon as the narrative begins to grow, black and white morality begins to feel simplistic and nuance becomes more important. A group of villains who are all entirely evil would risk feeling bland by the end, each one a different take on the same old flavor. Even the stories I enjoy, which have an unfathomable force of evil as the ultimate villain, tend to push that force into the background and rely on more nuanced antagonists to give the story more personal depth and elevate the conflict from a simple binary. The Harbingers trailer caught my attention because it portrayed them as fractured, uneasy alliance, each clearly with their own agenda and motivations. Those earlier hints of death plus their obvious conflict in the trailer had me intrigued. To me, they came across as a group of antagonists who ranged from utterly evil to perhaps even a lighter moral grey, and it opened up the possibility for us to have the same goal as them in the end, and perhaps our conflict with them would become a disagreement about tactics rather than goals. That sounded far more interesting. It's important to emphasize that that's just how I happen to feel about villains. It's pretty common for people to have a fixation on them instead, where they actively look for stories with strong villains as antagonists. In part, this is because antagonists are often active rather than passive. They drive the story forwards when the protagonist is reluctant to act, so their presence on the screen often means something interesting is about to happen. It's natural to anticipate and enjoy their scenes much more on average. For a lot of people, there's also a fascination with those who live outside the rules, who break the expectations of those around them. For others, there's a thrill more often associated with the horror genre, which can imbue a story with greater sense of danger, which they find more enthralling. What these people saw in the Winter Knights Lazo was sometimes very different. It was perhaps just as plausible that each Harbinger was intended to be a different archetype of villain. Instead of variety in their level of morality and how they feel towards their peers, it could have been a promise that they would pose a different type of evil. Different preferences, different expectations, different interpretations of the same trailer. And since it's a piece of marketing rather than a slice of in-game narrative, that ambiguity, that room for speculation, was perhaps the point. However, I always found it interesting that so much of the discussion centered on the voice lines. After that trailer dropped, Hoyo added a number of new voice lines to Childe's profile, one for each of the Harbingers in that trailer. People went to town interpreting what they said, speculating about the personalities and powers of each based on what we had seen and what we had now been told, plus some other ephemera which seemed related. The strange part to me was that so many took them at face value. After all, if we were to take that same approach to certain other voice lines, then Albedo is the best, Jean is the best, Kaya is the best, Lisa is the best, and only Diluc is weird. I've always felt that character voice lines tell us more about the perspective of the character we're listening to than they do about the character they're discussing. The lines are subjective, grounded in the way the speaking character views the world, shaped by the biases and assumptions inherent in them. Given enough voice lines from multiple characters, we could get a rough idea of how others view any given character, but until we actually get to know them for ourselves, I would not consider anything set in stone. While it might sound like my ideal is for the story to not have any villains at all, that's actually not the case. I can't help but think back to one fantastic long-running story which handled depth and breadth of villains with incredible nuance, Worm by Wildbow. It starts with a bullied, outcast teenage girl who gains a superpower. She wants to become a hero, but is mistaken as a villain and decides to work undercover to collect enough evidence that she can turn the local team of villains over to the authorities. But as she slowly gets sucked into the dark underworld hidden within her city, the lines of morality blur. The heroes she encounters are not the honorable, upstanding people she expected. The villains she works with have their good sides, and she quickly discovers that there are far worse threats out there, including a group of superpowered serial killers who begin to terrorize the city. And they aren't even the biggest threats, as the world slowly tips towards the brink of an apocalypse. It's a story filled with moral compromises, with people making false assumptions, in which the facade of good and evil are well and truly deconstructed. We get to see the world through the eyes of all these factions at different times, and it's fascinating to see the disconnect between how the world sees each group and character and who they are behind the scenes. That is a world in which the villains are compelling. After the Winter Night's Lasso, those hints at moral nuance to the Fatui and the Harbingers continued to grow over time, and our perspective on the world progressively became less black and white. The portrayal of the foot soldiers continued to deepen, for example, that memorable questline about the troop left abandoned in the depths of the chasm. More noticeably, the Harbingers we encountered began to embody that potential for the moral nuance I had hoped to see. Scaramouche epitomizes this journey. His part in Sumeru added context to his character, and even when his past was rewritten, it didn't change his abrasive personality at first. Instead, we've seen slow but steady growth, a gradual softening through the influence of those around him, and a growing mutual trust between him and the Traveler, which culminated in him putting his entire existence in Sandroni's hands simply because we said she could be trusted. In contrast, the Torre was an absolutely fantastic and completely irredeemable villain, hell-bent on treating the entire world as his experimental laboratory, with no regard to the lives of anyone else. Capitano, on the other hand, perhaps looked the most intimidating in the trailer, and yet turned out to be a bastion of honor and grace. He had the same goal as the Natlan team, but favored different methods. My biggest disappointment with him was that he gave up on that too easily. While there were occasional grumblings about the awkward way Scaramouche became Wanderer, Arlecchino's introduction was the point where people really started calling retcon. From what I remember, these accusations were based on 2 voice lines plus 1 side quest involving her subordinates. We had 1 voice line from Child and 1 from Wanderer. Child thinks she's crazy because she would betray the Tsaritsa if it benefited her cause, while Wanderer thinks she's a wolf in sheep's clothing who puts up a graceful front which hides a crazy interior. As I've said earlier, I think the idea that any character voice line can be taken as objective truth misunderstands their purpose. They can each show us one impression of how a character acts in one specific context, but that will always leave a lot of room for different takes on why someone might have that perspective on the character and how accurate it is to their fundamental essence. In this case, we're looking through the eyes of 2 characters whose perspective is unreliable at the best of times and who only see Arlecchino in the context of how she acts around the other Harbingers. They paint an evocative picture, and it's understandable that people who love crazy evil villains took that and ran with it. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that Child is fanatically loyal and very myopic, while Wanderer always assumes the worst of people. No matter what they said, nothing was set in stone, and many other possibilities could be just as consistent with those impressions. The more concrete source of speculation was the very special Fortune Slip world quest in Inazuma. The quest sees us infiltrate a network of Fatui spies embedded in the Grand Narukami Shrine. Our target turns out to be an Inazuman orphan who was taken in by the Fatui and brainwashed to serve their purposes. We learn that she's grown to love her false identity as a shrine maiden and to despise the cruelty of her handler, so we help her fake her death to set her free. While Arlecchino herself doesn't appear directly in this quest, her reputation looms large. She runs the orphanage, which raises the Fatui agents, and her authority looms over everyone even in her absence. There's an implied chain of fear and obedience, with the handler saying, "My patience is limited," as is that of Lady Arlecchino, and the operation itself involves stirring up war and conflict across Inazuma. However, we learn that this is not an operation which Arlecchino authorized. The agent acted on his own initiative, outside of the chain of command, so yet again the sequence of events didn't tell us much about her we could trust. All we could truly say for sure was that she might not approve of the methods the agent was attempting to use to achieve the Fatui's goals, and that even an operative who wanted out of their organization seemed to have some lingering loyalty to Arlecchino herself. This could have tied into that picture of her as an unhinged villain, but it did not tie Hoyo's hands. Instead, the Arlecchino we actually met turned out to be much more of an anti-hero than a villain. She lets people make false assumptions, avoids answering questions, and projects a cold and calculating facade when dealing with most people. She's stern but caring to those she feels responsible towards, and is viciously protective of those she cares about. She is ruthless, and she would unleash her fury even at the Tsaritsa if their interests were at odds. It just happens that our interests align at first, and she comes to see us as her allies. Some people insist that her predecessor, Crucipina, was the character originally intended to take her place, and that Hoyo decided to kill the real Knave and replace her with someone more sellable. But Arlecchino is not a good person. She leads an intelligence organization which adopts orphans and trains them to become spies and potentially even child soldiers. She does this with less cruelty and more care than the previous Knave, and she clearly disagrees with some of the more unhinged people within the wider organization, but that doesn't mean her actions and history are somehow all sunshine and roses now because she happens to align with our protagonist. It's certainly possible that they made that change of direction later on, but given the direction they were taking with the Fatui and with Celestia slowly becoming our true enemy, I kinda think it more likely that they always intended to reveal more layers of nuance beneath the facade, and that Arlecchino was the point at which their mask was supposed to slip. In Columbina's case, there were 3 voice lines from Child, Wanderer, and Arlecchino, though Arlecchino's came much later than the others. Child, someone who seeks out strong opponents, says he would not challenge her because he has no idea why she has such a high rank in the Harbingers, and therefore something just doesn't feel right. Some people interpret this as a sign she was secretly terrifying, but if that were the case, then surely he'd want to pit his strength against hers. It seems more likely that she's just so different from his expectations of a Harbinger that he doesn't know how to categorize her at all. Wanderer describes her as oblivious and innocent, unconcerned and unfeeling. He says he could challenge her to a fight, but that a traveler with their conscience should stay away from her. I've seen people take that stay away from her as a warning, but in context, it seems more like the Wanderer is saying that the traveler would probably win the fight and then feel bad about it afterwards, perhaps because he thinks she is as innocent as she seems. In the Winter Knight's Lazzo, while every other Harbinger took part in a guarded conversation, Columbina was draped across Signora's coffin, singing, off in another world entirely. If you accepted those voice line interpretations, her portrayal in the trailer could build a coherent picture. Someone who floats through a life, appearing pure and innocent at first glance, but who is unsettling enough to give 2 combat-hungry Harbingers pause. That combination led to the creepy child archetype, an innocence which persists even in the face of untold horrors, or perhaps even despite perpetrating them. Again, it's understandable why many people saw that and said yes please. But that was a very big if, and a lot of speculation built atop a very shaky foundation. Meanwhile, Arlecchino's voice line comes across as genuine fondness, an almost maternal feeling towards someone who's half innocent, half unknowable, with no hint of conflict whatsoever. By the time we got this voice line, we knew Arlecchino personally. While I still wouldn't trust any one character's word on any other to be objective truth, her implied closeness to Columbina hints that we can give it a little more weight than the others who viewed her from a distance. In the end, Columbina turned out to be someone who never really fit within a villainous group in the first place, and in retrospect, even her behavior in the Winter Knight's Lazzo fits with the final take on who she was: separated, isolated, disconnected from the others, and completely uninvolved in their machinations. Child and Wanderer's perspectives on her still make sense given this current incarnation, despite the disconnect between what we got and that vision people constructed from the initial clues. It's certainly possible that they originally intended her to be some eldritch abomination. It's also possible that the thought never crossed their mind. Either way, the term retcon is again meaningless here because there was no continuity for them to contradict. The few small hints about her do fit in the end, just in a way that's different from what some people wanted. Once again, our first impressions of Sandroni were limited to voice lines from Child, Wanderer, and Arlecchino, which were much more consistent this time around. Child says she's always engrossed in her research to the point that he's only met her a few times, but that each time she looked like she wanted to murder him. Wanderer says she has a terrible personality and cares for nothing outside of her own research. Arlecchino is similarly dismissive, stating she has little interest in her, noting her passion for her research and her reclusiveness as well. There was also a world quest line in Fontaine called Questioning Melusine and Answering Machine, which is generally assumed to be connected to her. It involves the search for the missing mechanical mascot of the Steambird, in which we team up with a lie-detecting robot to hunt down the culprit. After we capture the person responsible, they escape, but later turn up mutilated, their tongue torn out with an apology note in its place. That quest never specifically names Sandroni as the mysterious harbinger who took revenge on the culprit. We guess that it's one with an interest in machine intelligence, and that, plus the location, leads to the conclusion that it must be Sandroni. She's also present in the prelude to Not Cry, in Effa's quest, in which she's an off-screen threat directing Fatui agents to hunt and capture a Dragon Sovereign AI for her research purposes. I remember people taking these crumbs and concluding she's some kind of an unhinged mafia boss dealing out horrific punishments and ruling with an iron fist, but to me it still fit with the idea of a cold, dangerous harbinger obsessed with automatons. We finally met her in person in Not Cry, and she was an interesting character. At the time, many expressed disappointment that yet again Hoyo made a harbinger far less antagonistic than they had expected, but I quite enjoyed her portrayal as a typical tsundere, cold and hostile at first, then slowly revealing her inner warmth. Her relationship with Arlecchino seemed to fit. There was always a polite indifference there, like they were familiar with each other, but perhaps even working together, but without any particular personal connection between them. Meanwhile, her relationship with Columbina was a highlight for me, as we explored at the start of the video. One detail, which I found disappointing, was the treatment of the Fatui subjugation of Not Cry. When we first met her, Sandroni asserted that Not Cry is the Fatui's dominion, and with the ominous research institute on the horizon, it seemed like a fantastic setup for some large-scale conflict between the Fatui and the natives of the region, with Sandroni at the center of it. This promise ended up sidelined completely as soon as Reverie became a threat. While I think it would have been interesting to see the conflict which would have followed if their alliance had been temporary, I enjoyed the story which turned out to be the actual focus of Not Cry more than enough to compensate for the disappointment in how that potential conflict disappeared. Overall, I was happy personally, and it seemed like most people felt that her personality was again a pretty solid fit for the crumbs we'd known before. And so we return to the final gift. The aspect of this trailer which actually stirred up controversy was the context leading up to Columbina's pillow fight. After the Harbingers meeting, we see Sandroni return to her rooms alone, only to be disturbed by Columbina at her door once more. She rebuffs Columbina's offer of companionship, but then Arlecchino and Signora appear as well, and the four of them end up having a tea party together. The atmosphere is cozy, with giggling as they share cake and idly chat about an opera performance earlier that day. It again highlights Columbina's fixation on Sandroni and Sandroni's frustration at her attention, plus it gives a little insight into Signora's perspective on the Tsaritsa's plans. This is yet another example of a depiction of the Harbingers which does not match the expectations many had of them. They felt we were promised a fractious group of villains who would naturally be in constant conflict with one another. Instead, we got a pajama party with cake. The tone of their interaction was another step along the path which they've been walking down ever since the Winter Nights Lazzo trailer dropped. And in particular, people felt this interaction contradicted Arlecchino's voice line about Sandroni, and saw it as a significant retcon. She said, "I have little interest in her." The trailer makes it clear that these tea parties were a regular thing. Surely, that's a contradiction. One important detail which adds a little extra context to their habits is that Sandroni seemed surprised that Signora was there as well. Signora says she bumped into Columbina and Arlecchino and got dragged along. To me, this implies that the usual tea parties did not include her, so Sandroni's "stop treating my room as your personal party venue" was specifically aimed at the others. The three remaining characters are ones we saw interact regularly throughout the entirety of Not Cry, and given their behavior across the past year, this trailer did not feel off to me. My interpretation is that Arlecchino consistently treats Columbina as a wayward child, like one of the orphans she so passionately cares for, but perhaps even more special due to her unique disconnection from the world. Her approach to caring for those children has always included an edge of harshness as she seeks to prepare them for the reality of a hostile world, so it would be understandable for Columbina to not quite comprehend that there's affection behind her actions. Meanwhile, Columbina has that fixation on Zandroni. Deep down she wants friendship, and even though all she's ever known is transactional relationships, she can't help but follow Zandroni around. Again, very reminiscent of a younger sister who idolizes her older sibling but doesn't understand how to connect and ends up being a constant irritation. It's perfectly within character for Arlecchino to pull rank and force Zandroni to indulge in little tea parties to keep Columbina company, even without her having any particular interest in Zandroni on her own behalf. And before anyone accuses me of coping or just defending a billion-dollar corporation, I'd like to point back to the very first section of this video in which I highlighted why a key story beat from this exact same scene was a clear break in continuity, which seriously bothered me, and which would be a legitimate retcon if it were to become the new status quo of how the Harbinger's past relationships are depicted going forward. I'm perfectly comfortable calling out a retcon when I see it. I can even understand why some might feel this edges into that territory. I even felt a little surprised at just how cozy it all seemed when I'd expected a more frosty and formal tea party, but in the end I just feel that what we got is consistent with the characters we knew. And that's without touching on the many other counter-arguments which people have put out. Some see it as a consequence of Arlecchino's statement in one of her voice lines that our ideals are not entirely aligned, and that there is information she will choose not to reveal to us, which happens to be unlocked at the same friendship level as her line about Zandroni. This seems plausible, though for it to make sense we'd need there to be other voice lines from her which were deliberately misleading too. Others argue it could be her differentiating between the different personas of Marionette and Zandroni, a clean break between the work relationship they have between almost rival Harbingers and the personal relationship they'd have outside of that. Or it could be Zandroni looking back on the past with nostalgia which warps the truth. After all, both of her trailers show her having full-on discussions and interactions with people who died long ago, so it's not outside the realm of possibility that the Pajama Party 2 was her reimagining what life could have been like if they'd all connected more. I think there's less evidence for these interpretations, but at the end of the day, we're all reading between the lines, regardless of which feels right to each of us. Which leads me back to that one lingering question I mentioned earlier. In a story where the protagonist doesn't have a personality or moral perspective to examine, is there anything for the antagonists to challenge? I kinda suspect there is. Even though the traveler lacks these things, the player doesn't. Every one of us brings a moral perspective to the story, and we'll all interpret the actions of the various factions through our own personal biases and understanding of the world. The narrative's treatment of the Fatui and the Harbingers is a challenge to our perspective. They were set up as shallow antagonists at first and presented as a rogues gallery of villains, but the more we learn, the more our assumptions and prejudices against them are picked away. It's more than a little clumsy, and it's a different path than the one that many hope they'd follow, but it is an interesting one. It's certainly possible that Hoyo scattered all these crumbs with the intention that they'd go in one direction and then change course later on. I personally don't think we have evidence either way. I suspect they had broad concepts early on, which they fleshed out over time, and the lack of detail in the hints they planted was designed to give them room to maneuver. In the end, the characters we got exist within the guardrails established for them, and for the most part, the continuity remains intact, even in the cases where the characters we got ended up wildly different from the fandom's favorite theories. That's why I think calling these moments retcons ultimately obscures the more interesting discussion. If we're disappointed because the story contradicted itself, we should say that. If we're disappointed because it failed to deliver on its promises, that's a different discussion. And if we're disappointed because our own expectations turned out to be different from the author's intent, that's a different conversation again. Speculation is part of the fun of following a long-running story. The trouble only begins when we start mistaking our favorite interpretation for the story itself. Until next time!